A grand temple be constructed in Somnath. K. M. Munshi claimed in 1951, and I am quoting him, you will see the contemporary relevance of this. Munshi says, for 1,000 years, Mahmud's destruction of the shrine has been burnt into the collective subconscious of the Hindu race as an unforgettable national disaster. So that this has been burnt into the psyche of the Indian, this humiliation or this destruction of the shrine. In fact, however, there was no evidence of a 1,000-year-old trauma. Munshi, unknowingly perhaps, was reflecting the colonial perspective created in the 19th century, nearly 800 years later, because the earliest mention discovered so far of Hindu trauma caused by this Muslim invasion occurs in 1843 when it is brought up in the British House of Commons. Colonial historiography since the 19th century has used events like this to evolve a notion of permanent confrontation between the Hindus and Muslims, laying the basis of the two-nation theory. The communalists picked up this theme and amplified it. The eminent historian, Professor Romila Thapar, using a multiplicity of sources, has convincingly demonstrated that no such permanent confrontation between Hindus and Muslims occurred historically as a result of the destruction of the Somnath temple. He shows the following. 150 years after the destruction of the temple, a Hindu king rebuilt the Somnath temple without even a mention of Mahmud having destroyed it. More important, 250 years later, land was given to a Muslim trader to build a mosque on the land belonging to the same temple's estates, with the approval of the local Hindu ruler, local merchants and priests. No sign of trauma. There is no sign of trauma in the collective memory of Hindus visible until it was a memory constructed much later under colonial patronage by their allies, the religious communal forces. Destruction of religious places was routinely done, and they were done across religions and sects, often to loot the wealth of those institutions or to establish authority in the ancient and medieval times, and was treated, it appears from Professor Thakur's account, as such. It didn't create any permanent trauma. Nehru himself had a much more nuanced account of Mahmud Ghazni than that portrayed by the colonial communal combine, where he sees him, I'm quoting Nehru, as far more a warrior than a man of faith, who used his army raised in India under a Hindu general named Tilak against his own co-religionist Muslims rulers in Central Asia. So the issue was not Hindu-Muslim, is what Nehru is emphasizing. The nationalist intelligentsia in the colonial period put forward a totally different interpretation of Indian history from the colonial communal one that I just mentioned, where they were not trying to create memories of historical trauma to create differences in the present. On the contrary, they drew on the reality of Indian society and how it organically dealt with religious, caste and other differences through birth of new religions like Buddhism, Jainism and Sikhism, or movements spanning many centuries like the Sufi and the Bhakti movements. Nehru perhaps best argues this position in his magisterial magnum opus, The Discovery of India. The lessons that Nehru tried to draw from Indian history were connected to his imagining India's future as a modern democratic country based on enlightenment values, which we call the idea of India. He focused on a critical aspect of India's civilizational history, which is an openness to reason and rationality, a questioning mind and acceptance of multiple claims to truth, a dialogical tradition of being in conversation and discussion with each other, the ability to live with difference, accommodate, adjust, resolve, and transform rather than violently crush difference. It's interesting, as you all know, that decades later, this is a point that Amartya Sen has been making repeatedly in his two celebrated works, The Idea of Justice and The Argumentative Indian. This is exactly, virtually in Nehru's words, he draws precisely these conclusions from our ancient past till today. Nehru draws from the Indus Valley civilization, the Rig Veda, the Upanishads, the epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata, the Gita, Buddha, Ashoka, Laudan Khilji, Amir Khusro, Akbar, Vivekanand to Gandhi to illustrate the above, these processes I discussed. He emphasized also how the shared tradition in language, music, poetry, painting, architecture, philosophy, and everyday practice, cutting across religion and caste, contributed to the creation of a composite culture. While talking of songs composed by Amir Khusro, he said, I'm quoting, I do not know if there is any other instance anywhere of songs written 600 years ago by Amir Khusro, which are sung till today in all exactly the same words, by people, by millions across the country, cutting across all religions. He talked of the emergence of the Indian civilization that occurred over the centuries through the absorption, assimilation, and synthesis of all the influences India was exposed to through trade, invasions, migration, intermixing and intermixing. From the Indus Valley civilization 5,000 years ago to the Dravidian, I'm quoting him, Aryan, Central Asian, Iranian, Greek, Parthian, Bactrian, Scythian, Hun, Arab, Turk, early Christian, Jewish, Zoroastrian, Afghan, and Mughal influences, all, as he says, leaving their mark. And in his beautiful language he says, like some ancient palimpsest on which layer upon layer of thought and reverie had been inscribed, and yet no succeeding layer was completely hidden or erased what had been written previously. It is to this organic process through which the Indian people had learnt to negotiate difference of multiple religious languages, caste, etc., that colonialism came as a shock. It is as if Indian history ceased, that is stopped, to use a phrase used by the African revolutionary Amilcar Cabral. Indian history ceased for virtually 200 years. Colonialism not only stopped the dynamic process of negotiating difference, but actually froze or even actuated these differences. And the communal forces were the chief instruments in the hands of accomplishing this task of accentuating these differences. The world has learnt at a very heavy cost, from Ireland, the oldest colony, to recent events in Palestine, about which Nehru has a lot to say, the role of imperialism in what is happening in Palestine today. The world has learned from all this at the experiences of large parts of Asia and Africa, including India, that the longest lasting legacy of colonialism is not economic backwardness. The longest lasting legacy of colonialism has been that it left behind a divided people, as we are learning today. One method used by the colonial communal forces to create a religious divide, of which Nehru was very critical, was the colonial periodization of Indian history. This was done, as you know, by James Mill in the early 19th century into three major periods: the ancient or Hindu, the Muslim, and the British period. Nehru is very critical of it as early as the 1930s. He says, it is unscientific to divide history like this. This division is neither intelligent nor correct. It is deceptive and gives a wrong perspective. It deals more with the superficial changes at the top than with the essential changes in the political, economic, and cultural development of the Indian people. He continues to say, it is wrong and misleading to talk of Muslim invasion of India or of the Muslim period in India, just as it would be wrong to refer to the coming of the British to India as a Christian invasion or to call the British period in India a Christian period. He questioned the defining of a period by just the religion of the ruler and emphasized the wider social and economic and cultural factors which defined a period, and also pointed out the continuities and the cultural intermixing of people belonging to different religious faiths. Later historians, almost every major historians that you know of in India, have confirmed Nehru's position on this, critiquing the colonial communal periodization of Indian history. I mention this only to say that he spearheaded this. Nehru was extremely critical of looking at history with the, I'm quoting, the old and completely out-of-date approach of a record of doings of kings and battles and such like. He said, the whole conception of history of a country being the names of a large number of kings and emperors and our learning them by heart is long dead. I'm quite sure, unfortunately he was wrongly sure, whether in the schools and colleges of India it has ceased to exist or not. But I hope at any rate that it is dead, because anything more futile than children's study of the record of kings, regions and battles, I cannot imagine. On the contrary, Nehru anticipated what is now globally an accepted norm in cutting-edge historiography. He emphasized the social aspects of history. I'm quoting Nehru. He said, much closer research into the daily lives of the common man, maybe in family budgets, 100 or 1,000 years ago, which makes us realize something of what the life of humanity was in the past age. As he put it in his characteristically beautiful prose, he says, it is only then that we really clothe the dry bones of history with life, flesh and blood. Nehru was deeply aware of the various biases in history, in the writing of history, and very critical of the Europe-centric stroke colonial approaches, which often overlap, and which unfortunately exercise considerable influence, including in the former colonies till today. Giving the inaugural address to the Asian History Congress, Nehru said, the immediate object of History Congress should be to straighten out all the twists which Asian history has received at the hands of the Europeans. While some of them are very fine historians, their approach has nevertheless been based on Europe being the center of the world. He continued, in the case of India, a Western scholar, especially from the United Kingdom, inevitably tended to look at the history of India as if the past few thousand years were a kind of a preparation for the coming British dominion in India. However, Nehru warned that as a reaction to that, sometimes our own historians have gone too far. There is a nationalist history which, starting from a strong nationalist bias, praises everything that is national at the expense of other things. As early as 1930s, reacting to the tendency to imagine a quote-unquote a golden age in the past, which the communalists used to create a religious division, he said, everywhere are to be found people who consider their own country the best and regard it as sacred soil. They only study their ancient history and award it a high place. It becomes Satyayug or Ramrajya, and the hope remains that the same may be restored. He argued both these approaches, the nationalist approach and the imperialist approach, distort history. They sometimes suppress history. Nehru showed in his own writings, particularly in the glimpses of world history and also the discovery of India, how one could be firmly anti-imperialist and also have pride in one's own history for the genuine achievements without resorting to blind, imaginary glorification of one's past, overlooking all the warts and blemishes. I have more to say of this at the end of my address. While on the subject of Eurocentric colonial positions, Nehru very early on refutes the tendency to obfuscate the difference between the empires of the ancient and medieval period and the modern colonial empires emerging with the rise of capitalism. This is a tendency which has shockingly continued till today. He says, as early as 1933, there have been vast empires for thousands of years, but modern imperialism is a new concept developed for the first time in recent years. But very few of us have understood its real import and often mistake it for imperialism of the old. Unless we understand this new imperialism properly and discern its roots and branches, we cannot grasp the conditions of the present day world and cannot properly wage our battle for freedom. This confusion between pre-modern empires and the colonial empires, as Nehru says, has continued till today, and all you have to do is read, for example, Frederick Cooper and Jane Burbank's work called Empire in World History to see that this is being argued globally, even till today, by many people. Throughout the pages of the voluminous glimpses of history, world history, Nehru maintains and highlights the clear distinction and explains the very complex evolution of modern imperialism. Nehru repeatedly questions the colonial characterization picked up by the communalists of the medieval period when many of the rulers in India were Muslims as foreign rule, clearly distinguishing it from British colonial rule, which he described as foreign rule. Lest all of you think that one is stating the obvious, or that Nehru was stating the obvious, one may point out that our current Prime Minister repeatedly from the ramparts of the Red Fort in his Independence Day speech, his speech in Parliament as Prime Minister in 2014, his address to the US Congress in 2023, I'm just citing 3 instances, there are several more, he reiterates the RSS position and talks of 1,000 years of foreign rule in India. You can see how important the distinction that Nehru is making. With one stroke, all Muslim rulers were declared as foreigners from whose alleged loot and slavery India had to win independence. Look at the paradox. The forces which did not play a part in the actual struggle against foreign rule, that is the actual struggle against British imperialism, except to join them to fight the national movement, they now talk of freedom from a so-called Muslim rule in the medieval period. So the modern imperialism was not questioned, but a medieval foreign rule is what they are now trying to liberate India from. Nehru commented on this aspect, distinguishing the medieval period when many rulers were Muslim in India from the British period. And let me just quote him a bit on this. He says, the so-called Hindu ancient period is vast and full of change, of growth and decay, and then growth again. What is called the Muslim or medieval period brought in another change, and an important one, and yet it was more or less confined to the top and did not vitally affect the essential continuity of Indian life. The invaders who came to India from the northwest, like so many of their predecessors in more ancient times, became absorbed into India and part of our life. Their dynasties became Indian dynasties, and there was a great deal of racial fusion by intermarriage. A deliberate effort was made, apart from a few exceptions, not to interfere with the ways and customs of the people. They looked to India as their home country and had no other affiliations. India continued to be an independent country. The coming of the British made a vital difference, and the old system was uprooted in many ways. They brought an entirely different impulse from the West, which had slowly developed in Europe and was taking shape in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The British remained outsiders, aliens and misfits in India and made no attempt to be otherwise. Above all, for the first time in India's history, a political control was exercised from outside and an economy was centered in a distant place. He is using language that is used by Marxists even now, especially the world system analysts. They use exactly the language that Nehru was using in the 1930s. They made India a typical colony of the modern age, a subject country for the first time in a long history. A few more points, since I'm talking to distinguished historians, I'm going to focus. This is a very long address. I'll read only part 1 and 2. The rest I'll summarize in 3 minutes. Because the first part is Nehru and the discipline of history. I thought I'll just focus on that. That is what I was advised. And the other parts, Nehru's contribution to the making of modern India, you can read in my address. A few more points on Nehru and history writing which are relevant today. From very early on, Nehru was a votary of looking at history in a global context. An exponent of what is now fashionably called connected histories. He said, the old idea of writing a history of any one country has become progressively out of date. It is impossible today to think of the history of a country isolated from the rest of the world. The world is getting integrated. We have to consider history today in a world perspective. Further, he said, it is quite impossible today to think of current events or of history in the making in terms of any one nation or country or patch of territory. You have inevitably to think of the world as a whole. As a man of action, one who contributed significantly to the making of modern India, Nehru saw that the need to keep the big picture in mind while approaching history. Very wise words which our young students must pay attention to. He said, it has been given to us in the present age to play a part in the making of history. And for a person who does that, it becomes an even more important thing to understand the process of history so that he may not lose himself in trivial details and forget the main sweep. He urged historians not to get lost in the details so that they may see the wood a little more and not be lost in the individual tree. Any subject, he said, that you may investigate should be viewed in relation to a larger whole. Otherwise, it has no real meaning except as some odd incident which might interest you and your friends. Again, as a man of action, Nehru urged historians that they should not always write only for their brother historians, for the charmed circle of people who are interested in a specifically narrow aspect. They should try to appeal to the minds of the larger public, the intelligent or semi-intelligent public. He did not believe, and this is important, he did not believe that popularization means a deviation from scholarship. I do not think there is any necessary conflict between real scholarship and a popular approach. Unless the masses understand it, our labor, he said, would be in vain, and books should be written keeping this in mind. Some of the tallest scholars in India, inspired by the Nehruvian dream, did try to do what he desired, writing school textbooks, popular pamphlets, and books which are understood popularly. From R.S. Sharma, Ramila Thapar, Bipin Chandra, Satish Chandra, Irfan Habib, D.N. Jha, Arjun Dev, Shri Musli Ranveer Chakravarti, Bindar Singh. I can go on. The tallest of the Indian scholars have kept what Nehru has said in mind, and that is why it is so difficult for the current forces to challenge and overthrow the historical worldview that has been created in India. Finally, a comment on how Nehru saw his role in taking the historical process forward. The lessons he learned from Indian history of the acceptance of the existence of multiple truths, of a non-violent dialogical tradition, of negotiating of truth claims and conflict, and arriving at a higher level of synthesis were greatly strengthened by his increasingly deeper understanding of Mahatma Gandhi and Gandhiji's practice. This involved a change in his own Marxist understanding, which he had argued till the mid-1930s, as seen in his autobiography, towards a more complex Gramscian Marxian understanding of how change was to be negotiated, which is reflected in his later writing, The Discovery of India. This shift in Nehru has been seen by many as Nehru's contradictory, vacillating nature, his total dependence and subservience to Gandhiji, his giving in to vested interest, and so on. We do not agree with that. In an insightful work, Manas Firak Bhattacharjee sees Nehru's doubts, his ambivalence, his openness, his engagement with apparently contradictory positions, not as his weakness, but as his strength. He is correctly critical of people like Pada Chatterjee, who dismiss Nehru's absolutely outstanding work, The Discovery of India, as a book of rambling, bristling with the most obvious contradictions. Or other scholars, such as the Eurocentric Marxist Terry Anderson, who shockingly rubbishes Nehru's Discovery of India as a steam bath of Schwarmerai with a Barbara Cartland streak, if you can believe this. This is in his book, The Idea of India. Sorry, The Indian Ideology. As Bhattacharjee argues, the idea of liberty needs to be reconciled with the presence of contradictions. No idea or truth claim can justify the sacrifice of human lives. It would mean the barbarism of truth. Ethics provides us to think of freedom without violence. Nehru did not sit on a horseback with sword in one hand and rush towards the whirlwinds of history, thinking they were giants he had to exterminate. He did not hallucinate from the desire to rid the world of all its ills and create a gigantic prison in the name of paradise. This is where Nehru learned from Gandhiji. He accepted Gandhiji's position that however good the end, the means had to be ethical and non-violent. For Gandhiji, his deep conviction on non-violence did not emerge from the fact that it was a brilliant tactic to fight the British, which of course it was, but from his philosophical position that nobody could make the claim of having arrived at transcendental truth or absolute truth. His belief in the possibility of multiple truths and multiple paths to the seeking of truth would not allow for violence against anyone. The Enlightenment project emerging from Europe often faltered on this ground, where the notions of possessing the ultimate truth justified mass killings by revolutionary movements in the name of democracy and the people, thus negating the critical aspect of democracy itself, that is every human being's right to differ. Gandhiji saw this weakness in the French and the Russian Revolution as compared to the India struggle for freedom. Attention must be drawn here to Tad Ferdy's work, where he compares the European Enlightenment project with the Indian, Turkish and Iranian efforts at transition to modernity, with a focus on the Indian national movement under Gandhiji's leadership, with its, what he calls, the ethic of reconciliation as mass movement, as well as the Nehruvian effort after independence, which he calls the ethic of reconciliation in nation-making. His conclusion is that the Indian experiment at transition to modernity without violence remained much truer to the Enlightenment objectives than what were achieved or tried to be achieved in Europe. Bhattacharjee has done us a favor by quoting extensively from Octavio Paz. Octavio Paz, the great Mexican poet, thinker, diplomat, Nobel laureate, who was also the Mexican ambassador to India in Nehru's time, showing how he very sensitively comprehended what Nehru had discovered for himself from Indian tradition and Gandhiji, and how, very importantly, he brilliantly interpreted Nehru and his supposed contradiction. It is well worth repeating them here, if for no other reason but to show how great contemporaries of Nehru saw him, in contrast to scholars whom I would characterize as Eurocentric, if not colonial, and of course, the communal fake nationalists in India. In a speech delivered in 1966, this is what Kakatiya says. It is remarkable that Nehru, in spite of his mainly being a political leader, did not fall into the temptation of suppressing the contradictions of history by brute force or with a verbal sleight of hand. It is unique in our world of fanatical Menicians, that is those who see things only in black and white, and hangmen masked as philosophers of history. He did not pretend to embody either the supreme good or the absolute truth, but human liberty, man and his contradictions. He was faithful to his contradiction, and for this very reason, he neither killed others nor mutilated himself. In contrast to the majority of the political leaders of this century, Kakatiya says, Nehru did not believe that he had the key to history in his hand. Because of this, he did not stain his country nor the world with blood. You do remember that perhaps the Indian Revolution is the only revolution which was not followed by civil war. The entire period of transition from colonialism to post-colonial modernity occurs under the Nehruvian consensus. There is no mass killing of any kind from either side. Nehru tried to move forward towards his goal, what he thought was his historic role, with this sensibility. This meant following a path which could be slower, but it took people along and did not resort to violence and brute force, as many of his contemporaries trying the same transformation did in other parts of the world after being liberated from colonialism. We may ask ourselves the question that if Nehru was indeed as incompetent and evil as he's being described by certain forces, why the Mahatma chose him as his successor and not his other brilliant comrades like Radha Gopalachari and Sardar Patel. In a speech at the IHC on 15 June 1942, as early as that, Gandhiji said the following. Somebody suggested that Pandit Jawaharlal and I were estranged. This is baseless. Again, using imagery that only Gandhi could. He says, you cannot divide water by repeatedly striking it with a stick. It is important to mention this because, as you know, these days, the effort is to constantly divide our national movement. Nehru versus Bose, Gandhi versus Patel, Patel versus Nehru, Bhagat Singh versus Gandhi. I mean, that is as if the national movement was only fighting each other rather than the British. So Gandhi says you cannot divide water by repeatedly striking it with a stick. It is just as difficult to divide us. I have always said that not Rajaji, not Sardar Vallabhbhai, but Jawahar will be my successor. When I am gone, he will speak my language too. Even if this does not happen, I would at least die with this faith. Why did Gandhiji have such tremendous faith in Nehru? One can surmise only two reasons, and I will briefly mention that. First, Nehru quintessentially represented and fought for what Rabindranath Tagore called the idea of India. And what was it? The idea of India in brief, as I see it, is 5 core values. First, sovereignty, that is India will be independent and self-reliant and oppose imperialist domination globally. 2, democracy, that is India will be a democratic country with adult franchise, with equal rights to all citizens irrespective of their caste, class, language, gender, region or ethnicity. 3. Secularism, that is, people belonging to different religious faiths will have equal rights in the country. India will not be a majoritarian Hindu state. Nehru and Gandhi repeatedly say that the future India is not going to be a Hindu Rashtra. Secularism and democracy were seen as coterminous. One could not exist without the other. The term secular democracy was often used conjointly, just as communalism was joined with loyalism. Secular democracy and communal loyalism. The fourth item and idea of India was a pro-poor orientation. Beginning with the early nationalists like Dadabhai Naoroji, whose book was titled Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, to Gandhiji, turning the face of the country towards the poor, the Daridra Narayan, to the revolutionaries, socialists and communists, all were agreed on a pro-poor orientation, even if there was no consensus on whether India was going to be socialist or a communist country. Lastly, the fifth idea was that India shall have a modern scientific outlook, which was to be propagated. Nehru called it the scientific temper, that is, overcoming obscurantism and blind faith. It must be noted that there was a consensus among the entire spectrum of the Indian national movement on these 5 core values. That is why it is called the idea of India. Entire national movement, from the moderates, Nauroji, Kanade, Gokhale, to Tilak, Siyadas, to Bhagat Singh, to Gandhiji, Nehru, Patel, Bose, Acharya Narendra Dev, the socialists, JP, communists, EMS, Kishan Singh Soji, PC Joshi. Just think of any nationalist in this period. Across the spectrum, they agreed on these 5 core values. The only people who did not were the loyalists and the communalists, who now are masquerading as the nationalists. Not only did Nehru fight for these values during the freedom struggle, but he played a stellar role in implementing these ideas in the newborn state after independence. Gandhiji perhaps anticipated this capacity of Nehru in choosing him as his successor. In fact, the burden of implementing these ideas fell largely on Nehru's shoulders, with the Mahatma being murdered by a Hindu communalists within 6 months of India gaining independence, and Sardar Patel passing away in 1950. Nehru performed this task with great elan and imagination as India's first Prime Minister for about 17 years. It is on Nehru's role after independence in implementing the 5 core values of the idea of India that my address is focused. It is necessary to do so because today, as we will see very briefly, each one of this idea of India is deeply threatened. When we evaluate Nehru implementing the idea of India after independence, we must remind ourselves of what economists call the initial conditions from which we had to start, to get an idea of the gigantic task ahead of him at independence. The poet Rabindranath Tagore, shortly before his death, had graphically anticipated the conditions of India at the end of British rule. This is what Tagore says. The wheels of fate will someday compel the English to give up the Indian Empire. What kind of India will they leave behind? What stark misery when the stream of their centuries' administration runs dry at last. What a waste of mud and filth will they leave behind them. The mud and filth left behind was a famine-ridden country. 3 million perished just 4 years before independence. It was a country where per capita income and food grain output was declining annually for 3 decades continuously before independence, where average life expectancy at independence was a shocking 30 years. People died on an average by the time they were 30. The poor died much earlier. On top of all this, the British left the country deeply divided on religious lines, with millions dead and rendered homeless in a communal carnage that occurred under colonial tutelage. It was a gigantic task indeed to lift India out of this misery following the path laid down by the freedom fighters in their imagination of independent India. It is to Nehru's credit that he evolved a multi-pronged strategy to lift India out of this morass, which in fact became an example for numerous other aspects, historically, I emphasize, historically unique task of creating a modern democratic nation state in a of promoting modern industrialization within the parameters of democracy in a backward and colonially structured economy, of finding the balance between growth and equity in an impoverished, famine-ridden country, of empowering the people and yet expecting them to tighten their belt for the sake of the nation, of promoting the highest level of scientific education, a field left barren by the colonialists. In short, of unstructuring colonialism and bringing in rapid economic development, but doing it consensually, without the use of force, keeping what has been called the Nehruvian consensus intact in the critical formative years of the nation. A Herculean effort was needed to achieve this task, and Nehru rose to the occasion, putting everything he had in this effort. In the process, leaving behind a legacy not only for the Indian people, but for the peoples of the world oppressed by colonialism, who were striving to liberate themselves of their past, but in a humane and democratic manner. In the rest of the time I have, I will very briefly, I will not be reading out anything more, discuss what I do in the rest of the paper, and mention a few points on how he attempts to implement the various elements of the idea of India. Since the secular vision of idea of India was severely threatened at the birth of the independent Indian state itself, and is again likely, and is again today at the gravest risk with the rise of communalism, I begin in my next section, section 3, with the communal challenge. That is the longest section in my address. I show how the leaders of the Indian national movement, particularly Gandhiji and Nehru, dealt with the virtual Holocaust-like situation between 1946 and 48, which culminated with the murder of the Mahatma and the killings of lakhs of people and millions being made homeless. The leaders of the national movement, particularly Nehru and Gandhi, took on the communal challenge frontally and staked their lives to protect the minorities, in this case the Muslims, and thus democracy itself. They were not afraid of using the Muslim word, fearing that they will lose Hindu votes. They refused to allow India to become the mirror image of Muslim Pakistan, a Hindu Rashtra. In this section, I highlight, and this is what they did between the period 46 to 50. In this section, I highlight this aspect, what they did in this period and what we can learn from that, and some other lessons we can learn from Nehru, who had a deep understanding, probably the first to have a deep understanding of communalism in India. As early as the 1920s and 30s, he's writing about it, much before W. Smith and others in 1940s. First, just quick 5 points. First, Nehru emphasizes the need to oppose both minority and majority communalism. Lessons we can learn today, every political person can learn today. He wants that the response to one communalism cannot be the other communalism. As he put it, I'm quoting him, one communalism does not end the other. They feed on each other and they both fatten. Second, in relation to this, he says, in fact, these two communalisms, the minority and majority communalism, often cooperate with each other to keep the secular forces at bay. Witness the Muslim League and the Hindu Mahasabha joining hands in their opposition to the Indian National Congress. Secularism is their main opposition. The other communalism is not actually their main opposition. They actually even formed governments together, as you know, the Muslim League and Hindu Mahasabha. Third, Nehru warned that while minority communalism tends to be separatist, majority communalism can easily masquerade as nationalism. Though In reality, they are anti-national as it breaks the Indian nation. Now, this is very important that he's telling you in the 1930s that majority communalism can easily masquerade as nationalism. As he puts it, Hindu nationalism is just another name for communalism. It is in reality anti-national and reactionary. During the national movement days, the word Hindu nationalism was not used. They were called communalists. It's a great pity that from journalists to academics, people have now started using the word that the Hindu communalists use for themselves. That is Hindu nationalist. How can you call anybody? It's a misnomer, it's a contradiction in terms. In a multi-religious country, if you are Hindu nationalist, you break the nation. You are anti-national. Fourth, Nehru was the first to warn of the fascist nature of communalism. Just as Amartya Sen in 1993 was the first to use the term communal fascism for the fascist forces in India. He repeatedly warned of the fascist nature of the Muslim League and the RSS. I'm quoting Nehru. He says, communalism is in fact the Indian version of fascism. And by following this path, he says, the ultimate result would be similar to what happened to Hitler and fascism in Europe. I do not want India to follow this terrible path. Wise words which we need to heed today. Fifth, Nehru emphasized that both the use of state power and an ideological battle is necessary to combat communalism. After banning the RSS and putting 20,000 RSS workers in jail following Gandhiji's murder, and after giving a complete drubbing to the communal parties in the first general election of India in 1951-52, all the communal parties put together could not get more than 10 seats. After doing that, Nehru has the following to say. He gives the following warning, which we must listen with great care. He says, winning an election, banning communal organizations, arresting arresting those who promote violence are important steps, but they are not enough. He said, the communal poison has permeated the land, and we have to uproot this despicable communalism. It must be obliterated from this land so that it may not take roots again. To achieve this, Nehru says, the superior force of the state is necessary, but it is not enough. Because, as he said, those who are impelled by a faith in a cause, in other words, the bhakts, can seldom be crushed by superior force. They can only be defeated by a higher idealism. Very wise words. The higher idealism that he offered to communalism was a secular, humane, inclusive, pro-poor nationalism. In other words, not to abandon the nationalist platform to the communalists, but to appropriate it at a higher idealistic level. While waging this ideological battle, Nehru, the great believer in civil liberties and the freedom of the press, nevertheless argued that communal propaganda, spreading hatred through lies, humors, creating enmity, should not be tolerated and must be suppressed with a heavy hand. He, in fact, in 1956, proposed a law that the media, which meant the press at that time, which spread hatred, I'm quoting him, and even made money out of it. You can see the resemblance to the TRP ratings that people talk about today, should be dealt with strictly and punished. You can see much can be learned from Nehru as we watch how the hate media flourishes today with state patronage. In section 4, I discussed Nehru's critical role in building and nurturing the institutions of democracy. A functioning parliament with respect for the opposition, not notion of opposition mukt parliament, an independent judiciary, less said the better, independent bureaucracy, a non-political armed forces, a free press, and above all, for Nehru, an independent education system. What Nehru had to say about universities has already been quoted. Each one of these is under threat today. Each one of these institutions of democracy that I've talked in this section are under threat today. In the next section, section 5, I discuss how Nehru makes, and I underline, the historically unique effort at economic transformation with democracy and sovereignty. No country in the world made the transition to industrialism with democracy. I show how, in a very brief period, he was able to unstructure the colonial structure with massive progress in industry and agriculture. I also discussed how he anticipated the knowledge revolution nearly by half a century and made huge progress in the areas of science and technology, enabling India to participate at whatever low level in this global information and knowledge revolution. The Nehruvian model became an example, as I said, to other post-colonial countries trying to develop in a humane, democratic manner. In section 6, I discussed how Nehru succeeds in keeping his gaze focused on the poor, the oppressed and disadvantaged. Never have the poor been abandoned as they are in India today. And that is what I try to talk about in this section. And why we need to look back at Nehru for this. I sum up in the last section with a brief discussion on Nehru and the scientific temper. Nehru's focus on the need to develop a scientific temper, a term he coined in the discovery of India, which the Constitution of India in Article 51A, laying down the fundamental duties of every citizen of India, is this notion of the scientific temper is being made a mockery of today. Nehru said, the scientific temper, I'm quoting him, points out the way along which man should travel. It is the scientific approach, the adventurous and yet critical temper of science, the search for truth and new knowledge, the refusal to accept anything without testing and trial, the capacity to change previous conclusions in the face of evidence, the reliance on the observed fact and not preconceived theory, the hard discipline of the mind. All this is necessary, not merely for the application of science, but for life itself and solution of its many problems. It is in this spirit that the quotation that was given about what a university stands for, that Nehru said, that it stands for humanism, tolerance, for reason, for the adventure of ideas and the search for truth. But in that paragraph, he adds one more thing which was not laid out, which I shall leave out to you. He says, but if the temple of learning itself becomes a home of narrow bigotry and petty objectives, how then will a nation prosper or a people grow in stature? Since all of us are involved in the university system and we are witnessing the effort to destroy it, from JNU to Delhi University to the UGC to just name every institution to the ICHR, these are words of Nehru that we must remember very, very much. What a contrast are we witnessing today? The university system I talked about. The Guardian quotes the current Prime Minister mixing up mythology about gods and goddesses with history and science while inaugurating a new hospital in Bombay. We can feel proud of what our country achieved in medical sciences at one point of time, the Prime Minister told a gathering of doctors and professionals. We all read about Karna in the Mahabharata. If we think a little more, we realize that the Mahabharata says Karna was not born from his mother's womb. This means that genetic science was present at that time. That is why Karna could be born outside his mother's womb. We worship Lord Ganesha There must have been some plastic surgeon at that time who got an elephant's head on the body of a human being and began the practice of plastic surgery. This is the Prime Minister. The Hindustan Times reported the governor of Bengal doing violence to both science and history, who said, while addressing, peculiarly, paradoxically, addressing a science and engineering fair in Kolkata, he said that the mythological character Arjuna, his arrow had nuclear power, and chariots mentioned in the Mahabharata actually flew. He, as you know, has since been promoted to become the Vice President of India. No wonder in our country today we fight Corona with state patronage, with Gobar, Gomutra, Thali, Yanima Thalis, Tali, shining torchlights, shining your mobile torchlights, Ganga Snan, and unverified medicines of a favored Jew. I mean, this is not a laughing matter that a country with such a long tradition of civilizational values and of scientific progress should be doing this. In sum, therefore, it is as if the political leaders have reversed their roles from that of pulling up society and bringing it in line with the highest global civilizational values, a role performed by the leaders of the Indian national movement like Gandhi and Nehru, to that of pushing society back by appealing to sectarian identities, accusative instincts, and traditional prejudices. The hegemonic idea of India, the common sense of the Indian people, created by the Indian national movement, is today severely challenged. And that challenge is not coming from a backward traditional people. Do understand, this challenge is not coming from our people. It is from the leaders and the state machinery. Nehru's fantastic effort to raise India from what Tagore called the mud and filth left behind by the British has now been replaced with the Indian people being pushed back into that same mud and filth of ignorance, obscurantism, disempowerment, unfreedom, and above all, communal hatred. Thank you.